A racist white woman slapped black triplets in first class. Then, moments later, their mom, the airline CEO, arrives. Those children do not belong here. The elderly white woman's voice sliced through the first-class cabin like a knife, her bony finger jabbing toward 3 8-year-old black boys seated in row 2. First class used to mean something. Where are their parents? Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac Mitchell sat frozen in their seats, their coloring books forgotten on their tray tables. 3 identical faces, 3 matching bow ties, 3 little suits their mama had pressed that morning so they'd look perfect for grandma's surprise party. 3 pairs of wide eyes were now filled with confusion and fear. The boys had been sitting quietly for 20 minutes, waiting for their mother to return from the restroom. They'd been coloring pictures of airplanes, Joshua working on the wings, Caleb on the tail, Isaac carefully filling in the windows. They hadn't been loud, hadn't been running around, hadn't done anything except exist in seats their family had paid for. But for Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, 73 years old with a face carved from privilege and prejudice, their very presence was an offense. She'd boarded late, huffing about the incompetence of gate agents who couldn't manage a simple boarding process, dragging her oversized carry-on down the aisle with the expectation that someone else would lift it for her. When she reached row 3, her assigned seat, and saw 3 black children directly in front of her, her expression twisted into something ugly. "This is unacceptable," she announced to the flight attendant helping her with her bag. "These children are clearly unaccompanied. They're too young to be in first class without supervision. I demand they be moved." The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah Chin who'd worked for the airline for 2 years, glanced at the boys' boarding passes clipped to their seat pockets. "Ma'am, these passengers are traveling with a guardian. They're properly ticketed for these seats." "I don't see any guardian," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "I see 3 children who look like they've never seen the inside of first class in their lives. Probably some charity mistake or stolen tickets. I've flown first class for 40 years and I know what belongs here." "What belongs here?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. Joshua, the oldest by 3 minutes, felt his chest tighten. His mama had taught them what to do when people said mean things. "Don't argue," she told them just that morning, kissing each of their foreheads before they boarded. "Don't get loud. Stay calm and polite no matter what. Some people won't like seeing you in nice spaces, but you have just as much right to be there as anyone else. Remember who you are." So Joshua stayed quiet, his hands gripping his blue crayon, trying to focus on his airplane drawing, trying to be good like Mama said. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't done. She lowered herself into her seat behind the boys, her disgust radiating like heat. She stared at the back of their heads, 3 sets of perfectly lined haircuts, 3 little bodies sitting respectfully, 3 children who'd done nothing wrong. And then she kicked Joshua's seat. The impact jerked Joshua forward, his juice box tipping over, spilling orange liquid across his drawing, across his tray table, across his lap. "Oh!" Joshua gasped, jumping up, trying to stop the juice from ruining everything. "Now, gentlemen, before you think this is just another story that doesn't concern you, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a child, any child, treated with cruelty they didn't deserve? Have you ever watched someone abuse their age, their position, their assumed authority to harm kids who couldn't fight back? Have you ever witnessed racism so blatant, so vicious, that it was directed at 8-year-olds in bow ties? If you believe children deserve protection regardless of their skin color, if you think first-class tickets should come with dignity, not discrimination, if you know that racism is not something to stand against, then you need to see what happened in the next 5 minutes on this flight. Because what Mrs. Patricia Whitmore did next would shock you. And what happened when the boy's mother finally appeared would change everything. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. Tell us if you've ever witnessed children being targeted because of their race. Share your story, because these boys' story is about to get much worse before justice arrives. And if you believe that no child, not one single child, should be kicked, insulted, or assaulted for the crime of being black in first class, hit that like button and subscribe to Hyper Racism channel. We expose the truth that too many people want to pretend doesn't exist anymore. Joshua turned around, his Sunday shirt now stained with orange juice, ready to apologize, Because that's what Mama taught him, always be the bigger person, always show grace even when others show hate. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said politely, his 8-year-old voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." The slap came so fast, so hard, that the crack of it echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Mrs. Whitmore's palm connected with Joshua's cheek with enough force to snap his head sideways, to knock his small body against the seat, to leave an immediate red handprint blooming across his brown skin. For one frozen second, the entire first-class cabin went silent. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every person who'd been reading or working or dozing, all of them stopped, horrified, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. An elderly white woman had just slapped an 8-year-old black child across the face. In public. On an airplane. For spilling juice that she'd caused him to spill. Joshua's eyes filled with tears, his hand going to his burning cheek, his small body trembling with shock and pain. Caleb, sitting in the middle seat, jumped up. "Don't hit my brother." His voice was fierce despite his fear, his little hands balling into fists, his protective instinct overriding everything Mama had said about staying calm. Mrs. Whitmore's response was to slap him, too. Another crack. Another red handprint. Another 8-year-old boy reeling from violence he'd done nothing to deserve. Isaac, in the window seat, began crying. Not quiet tears. Full sobbing that came from watching his brothers being hit, from fear that he was next, from the overwhelming confusion of being hurt by a grandmother-aged woman who was supposed to be safe. Mrs. Whitmore raised her hand toward Isaac. And that's when Sarah Chin, the flight attendant, finally unfroze from her shock and grabbed the woman's wrist. "Ma'am, you cannot strike passengers. That's assault." Mrs. Whitmore yanked her arm free, her face flushed with self-righteous fury. "Those children are disruptive and unaccompanied. Where is their mother? I demand to speak to whoever's responsible for them. I want them removed from this aircraft immediately." The boys huddled together in their row, all three crying now, Joshua's cheek blazing red, Caleb's eyes swelling with tears, Isaac hiccuping with fear. Their coloring books lay forgotten, their excitement about Grandma's party completely shattered. They were 8 years old. They were well-dressed and well-mannered. They had done absolutely nothing wrong. And they'd just been assaulted by a woman who looked at their skin and decided they were animals to be disciplined rather than children to be protected. Sarah Chen's radio crackled as she called for backup, her hands shaking, her training completely inadequate for this situation. Other passengers were standing now, shouting, some filming on phones, some demanding the woman be arrested, some trying to comfort the crying boys. But through the chaos, through the shouting and the crying and the cabin full of witnesses, nobody noticed the woman emerging from the first-class lavatory at the front of the cabin. Nobody saw her freeze as she heard her children crying. Nobody recognized her yet as she moved down the aisle, her elegant business suit, her natural hair in a perfect twist, her face shifting from confusion to horror to cold, lethal fury as she processed what she was seeing. 3 crying boys with red marks on their faces. An elderly white woman is being restrained by a flight attendant. Her babies. Someone had hurt her babies. Diane Mitchell had spent 30 years climbing from gate agent to CEO of this airline. Had faced discrimination at every level. Had survived and conquered and built a career on the principle that everyone deserved dignity and respect when they flew. She'd been in the private first-class suite at the very front, reviewing quarterly reports, trusting that her sons would be fine for 20 minutes while she worked. She'd been wrong. And now someone was going to pay for that mistake. But the passengers didn't know who she was yet. Mrs. Whitmore certainly didn't know. Even Sarah Chin, focused on restraining an elderly passenger who just committed assault, hadn't looked up to see who was approaching. They were all about to find out. And what happened next would become airline industry legend. Because you don't touch Diane Mitchell's children. Not without consequences that would end your life as you knew it. The reckoning was 10 steps away. And Mrs. Patricia Whitmore had no idea that the well-dressed black woman moving toward her with deadly purpose wasn't just an angry mother. She was the person who owned the entire airline. Every plane. Every seat. Every rule. Including the one that was about to destroy Patricia Whitmore's comfortable, privileged existence. 3 slapped children. 1 furious and a moment of racist violence that was about to cost everything. Diane Mitchell moved through the first-class cabin with the controlled grace of someone who'd spent 3 decades mastering composure under pressure. But her heart was hammering against her ribs, her mama bear instincts screaming as she heard Isaac's sobs, saw Joshua cradling his reddened cheek, watched Caleb trying to be brave while tears streamed down his face. Her babies. Her triplets. The 3 miracles the doctors said she'd never have after years of fertility struggles. The boys she'd raised alone after their father died in a car accident when they were 2 years old. The children who'd given her purpose through grief, who'd inspired her to keep climbing, keep fighting, keep proving that a black woman from Atlanta's West End could run an entire airline if she was willing to work harder than everyone else. The first-class cabin of Flight 2847 was the crown jewel of the airline's fleet, newly renovated with cream leather seats, polished wood accents, and subtle lighting that made everything feel expensive and exclusive. Each seat in rows 1 to 4 costs $3,200 for this cross-country flight. The private suite Diane had been occupying, row 1A, separated by a partition, cost $8,500 and came with a full bed, a dedicated flight attendant, and the kind of privacy that allowed CEOs to work undisturbed. She'd splurged on first-class seats for her boys because it was a special trip. Her mother's 80th birthday in Seattle. The boys had been so excited, trying on their little suits 3 times the night before, practicing their surprise shout for Grandma Rose, who had no idea they were coming. Diane had raised them to navigate a world that would judge them harshly. Had taught them the rules that black boys needed to know. Keep your hands visible, speak politely, never raise your voice, always be twice as good to be considered half as equal. She'd drilled into them the importance of dignity, of refusing to let other people's hatred make them hate themselves. But she'd never imagined she'd need to teach them how to survive being physically assaulted in first class while their mother was 20 feet away. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore stood near row 3, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her designer pantsuit impeccably pressed, her face flushed with indignation rather than shame. She was the kind of woman who'd lived her entire 73 years believing the world owed her deference. Old money from Connecticut. 5 generations of Whitmores who'd attended Yale. A life built on the unexamined assumption that people who looked like her deserved the best seats, the best service, the best of everything, while people who looked like Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac were interlopers to be challenged, questioned, and removed. She'd flown first class for 4 decades and had complained about the declining standards for 3 of them, code words for seeing more black faces, more brown faces, more people who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in premium cabins. Sarah Chin, the flight attendant, was still trying to process what had happened. She was 26, had taken this job to see the world, and had gone through training about de-escalation and passenger conflict. But nothing in her manual covered what to do when an elderly passenger assaulted 3 children. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Sarah said to Mrs. Whitmore, her voice shaking. "We're calling. I want to speak to whoever's supervising these children." Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her voice carrying that particular pitch of white entitlement that expected immediate compliance. "They're unaccompanied minors creating a disturbance. They don't have proper tickets. I'm their mother." Diane's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, quiet, controlled, but carrying an authority that made everyone in hearing distance stop and turn. She'd reached row 2 now, kneeling to her son's level, her professional composure cracking as she gathered all 3 boys into her arms. Joshua buried his face in her neck, Caleb grabbed her hand like a lifeline, and Isaac couldn't stop sobbing. "Shoo, babies, I'm here. Mama's here. You're safe now." Her hands gently touched Joshua's inflamed cheek, fury building in her chest as she felt the heat of the handprint. She checked Caleb next, seeing the same mark, the same evidence of violence against her children. "Ma'am," Sarah Chen's eyes had gone wide, recognition flooding her face as she really looked at the woman comforting the boys. "Ms. Mitchell? I didn't realize." Mrs. Whitmore, however, was still operating on assumptions. She saw a well-dressed black woman, but her prejudice wouldn't allow her to imagine this woman had any real authority. In her worldview, black women were nannies, assistants, service workers, never the ones being served. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore huffed. Are you their nanny? Their mother? Whoever you are, you need to teach these children proper behavior. They've been disruptive since boarding, and when I attempted to correct them. Correct them? Diane stood slowly, all 5 feet 8 inches of her rising with the kind of controlled fury that made Sarah Chin step back instinctively. You slapped my 8-year-old sons. Across their faces. For spilling juice that you caused them to spill when you kicked my son's seat. They were unaccompanied and they were sitting quietly in their assigned seats, coloring, waiting for me to return from the lavatory. They weren't running, weren't yelling, weren't bothering anyone until you decided 3 black children in first class offended your delicate sensibilities. Other passengers were gathering now, forming a semicircle around the confrontation. An older black gentleman in row 5 had stood up, his expression carved from recognition and shared pain. A young white couple in row 4 was filming, their faces shocked. A middle-aged Asian woman was crying, her hand over her mouth. I don't know who you think you are, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice dripping with condescension, but I am a platinum member of this airline. I've been flying first class since before you were born. I know what standards used to be, and I know that children like these. Children like what? Diane's voice dropped to something dangerous. Say it. Say what you really mean. Children like these, what, Mrs. Whitmore? The silence was absolute. Every passenger was holding their breath, waiting to see if this elderly white woman would actually say the quiet part out loud. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed deeper. Children who aren't accustomed to, who clearly don't understand how to behave in. You mean black children, Diane supplied, her voice sharp as a scalpel. You mean my sons don't belong in first class because they're black? That's what you mean. That's what all your coded language means. That's why you kicked my son's seat, why you slapped him when he apologized, and why you hit my other son when he tried to protect his brother. Because you looked at 3 8-year-olds in bow ties and saw a threat instead of children. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, trapped between her prejudice and the public spotlight now shining on it. I want to speak to a supervisor, she finally managed. This woman is being aggressive and... I am the supervisor, Diane said quietly. I'm the CEO of this airline. Every plane you see out those windows? I'm responsible for them. Every employee on this aircraft? They report to me. Every policy, every rule, every decision about who flies and who doesn't? That authority rests with me. The color drained from Mrs. Whitmore's face like someone had pulled a plug. Sarah Chin looked like she might faint. The passengers close enough to hear gasped audibly. You can't be. Mrs. Whitmore stammered. Can't be what? Can't be the CEO because I'm black? Or can't be the CEO because I'm a woman? Or is it the combination that's really confusing you? Diane pulled out her company ID badge, holding it up so Mrs. Whitmore and everyone else could see. Diane Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer. I worked my way up from a gate agent 30 years ago, Diane continued, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. I've loaded bags. I've cleaned planes. I've dealt with entitled passengers who thought people who looked like me were only good for serving them. I've faced discrimination at every level, fought for every promotion, and proved myself 1,000 times over while my white male colleagues were given opportunities one had to beg for. And I did all of that so my sons, so all children who look like them, could travel with dignity and respect. She looked down at her boys, still clinging to her, and her voice broke slightly. I did all of that so they wouldn't have to face what I faced. So they could grow up in a world that saw their potential instead of their skin color. And you, she turned back to Mrs. Whitmore, you just showed me I failed. Because here we are in 2025 on my airline, in first class, and my children just got slapped by a woman who thinks her race gives her the right to put her hands on them. Mrs. Whitmore was trembling now, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. But her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. I didn't know they were your children. If I'd known. If you'd known, you would have what? Not assaulted them? Does that make it better? Diane's voice rose for the first time. You only regret hitting them because they turned out to be connected to someone with power. But what about all the other black children you've encountered over your 40 years of flying? The ones without CEO mothers? Did you treat them with this same contempt? Did you think it was okay then? The question hung in the air, unanswered because everyone already knew the truth. Saracen was on her radio now, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Within 60 seconds, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his face grave. He took in the scene, the crying children, the furious the elderly woman who just made the biggest mistake of her life. "Ms. Mitchell," he said carefully, "what do you need from us?" What happened next would determine whether this moment became another story about discrimination that people asked about and forgot, or a catalyst for actual change. Diane looked at her sons. At Joshua's swollen cheek. At Caleb's red eyes. At Isaac's trembling hands. Then she looked at Mrs. Whitmore, at this woman who represented everything Diane had spent 3 decades fighting against. And she made a decision that would reverberate far beyond this flight. "Call the police," Diane said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore just committed assault and battery against 3 minors. I want her arrested." The cabin erupted. Some passengers applauded. Others gasped. Mrs. Whitmore's face went from red to white to green. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Whitmore whispered. "I'm 73 years old. You're going to have me arrested?" "You're 73 years old and you just slapped 3 8-year-olds, Diane replied. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm absolutely going to have you arrested. Age doesn't excuse racism. It doesn't excuse violence. And it certainly doesn't excuse putting your hands on my children." The police were already being dispatched. The plane wouldn't be going anywhere until this was resolved. And Mrs. Patricia Whitmore's comfortable, privileged life was about to collide with consequences she'd spent 73 years avoiding. Because this time, she'd targeted the wrong children. This time, their mother had the power to fight back. And this time, justice wasn't just a word. It was about to be delivered in handcuffs. Airport police were already on their way, but the 10 minutes it would take them to arrive felt like an eternity. The plane sat at the gate, boarding paused, other passengers watching through the windows as drama unfolded in first class. Mrs. Whitmore had retreated to her seat, her hands shaking, her mind clearly racing for a way out of this nightmare. She kept glancing at the exit door as if considering running, but 2 flight attendants had positioned themselves strategically in the aisle, blocking any escape. Diane had moved her sons to the private suite in row 1A, away from prying eyes and cameras, giving them space to calm down. She'd grabbed ice from the galley, gently pressing wrapped cubes against Joshua's swollen cheek, murmuring comfort to all 3 while her heart broke into pieces. "Mama, why did that lady hit us?" Isaac asked, his voice small and confused. "We were being good. We were quiet like you said." Diane's throat tightened. "How did you explain racism to 8-year-olds? How did you tell your children that some people would hate them for something they couldn't change and shouldn't have to? Baby, you were perfect. You did nothing wrong. That lady has something broken inside her that makes her treat people badly. That's her problem, not yours. You hear me? Not yours." But even as she said it, she knew the damage was done. Her sons had learned a lesson she'd hoped to delay for a few more years, that the world could be cruel, that adults could be monsters, that their skin color made them targets in spaces they had every right to occupy. Joshua touched his cheek gingerly. "Are the police really coming?" "Yes, baby. They are." "Is that lady going to jail?" Diane met her son's eyes, seeing fear mixed with something that looked like hope. Hope that maybe, this time, the bad guy would face consequences. That maybe the world wasn't completely unfair. "I don't know what will happen," Diane said honestly. "But I'm going to make sure everyone knows what she did. And I'm going to make sure she can't do it to anyone else's children. That's what I can promise you." Out in the cabin, Mrs. Whitmore was making phone calls. Diane could hear her voice rising, could catch fragments. "My lawyer. Outrageous, threatening an elderly woman. I have rights." Saracen appeared at the suite entrance, her face apologetic. "Ms. Mitchell, Mrs. Whitmore is demanding to speak with you. She says she has an apology to offer." Diane's jaw clenched. "An apology? She wants to apologize now? After police have been called? After my sons have been traumatized? I told her you weren't interested, but she's insisting it's urgent. She says She says she made a terrible mistake and wants to make it right before authorities arrive. Have you ever watched someone suddenly care about consequences only when they're about to face them? When they're about to lose their freedom, their reputation, their comfortable life? That's when remorse appears, not from genuine change, but from fear. Diane stood, kissing each of her sons' foreheads. Stay here, babies. Watch your movie. I'll be right back. She walked back into the main cabin, every eye following her movement. Mrs. Whitmore stood as Diane approached, her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant. Ms. Mitchell, please. I need you to understand, I'm not a racist. I have black friends. I voted for Obama. I just reacted poorly. I was tired from my connection. I have arthritis that makes me irritable. I didn't mean to hit your sons. It was instinctive, like swatting at. She stopped herself, but too late. The comparison hung in the air, ugly and damning. Like swatting at what? Diane asked quietly. At animals? At insects? At things that annoyed you? Mrs. Whitmore's face crumpled. That's not what I meant. Please. I'm 73 years old. I have grandchildren. If I'm arrested, if this goes public, my life is over. My reputation, my social standing, everything I've built. Everything you've built, Diane repeated slowly. You mean your reputation as a respectable member of society? The same reputation that allowed you to feel comfortable slapping 3 children without consequence? That reputation? I made a mistake. One moment of poor judgment shouldn't destroy everything. It wasn't one moment, Diane corrected. It was multiple decisions. You decided my sons didn't belong in first class. You decided to kick my son's seat. You decided to hit him when he apologized. You decided to hit his brother when he tried to protect him. You decided to raise your hand to a 3rd child. Those weren't instincts, Mrs. Whitmore. Those were choices. Through the aircraft windows, blue and red lights flashed. Airport police had arrived. Mrs. Whitmore saw them and grabbed Diane's arm. Please. I'll pay you. Whatever you want. I'll donate to charities. I'll write apologies. Just please call them off. Don't let them arrest me. I'm begging you. Diane looked at the hand gripping her arm. The same hand that had struck Joshua, had struck Caleb, had been raised against Isaac. She pulled away slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, do you know what I told my sons this morning before we boarded? I told them that first class wasn't just about nice seats and good food. I told them it was about being treated with dignity and respect. I told them they deserved to be there just as much as anyone else. And do you know what you taught them instead? Mrs. Whitmore shook her head, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. You taught them that no matter how well-dressed they are, how polite they are, how perfect their behavior, someone will always see them as less than. Someone will always feel entitled to put hands on them. Someone will always think they don't belong. Diane's voice hardened. So no, Mrs. Whitmore. I won't call off the police. Because maybe if you face real consequences, the next Patricia Whitmore will think twice before assaulting someone else's children. 2 police officers boarded the aircraft, their expressions professional but grim as Saracen briefed them on what had occurred. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore? The lead officer asked. Yes, but there's been a misunderstanding. Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault and battery on 3 minors. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists with a sound that echoed through the silent cabin. Passengers recorded on their phones. Some applauded. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own unexamined biases in Mrs. Whitmore's actions. As police led her down the aisle, Mrs. Whitmore looked back at Diane one final time. You'll regret this, she said, venom replacing her earlier pleading. I have lawyers. I have connections. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Diane smiled coldly. You're right. It isn't over. Because tomorrow morning, I'm implementing new policies across every flight this airline operates. And I'm making sure your name becomes a case study in what happens when entitled passengers think they can abuse children with impunity. So yes, Mrs. Whitmore, this is far from over. But not in the way you think. Police escorted Mrs. Whitmore off the plane and into custody. And Diane Mitchell returned to her sons, holding them close, promising them that justice wasn't just a word. Sometimes it came in handcuffs. Sometimes it came from mothers who had the power to make things right. And sometimes it came from refusing to accept that this is just how things are. The plane would fly 2 hours late. But the destination, a world where her sons could travel without fear, was worth every delayed minute. Flight 2847 finally departed 2 hours and 17 minutes late. But by the time the wheels left the ground, Diane Mitchell had already set in motion changes that would reshape the entire airline industry. She sat in the private suite with her sons tucked against her sides, their little bodies finally relaxing as exhaustion overtook adrenaline. Joshua had fallen asleep with his head on her lap, ice pack still pressed to his cheek. Caleb held her hand, occasionally squeezing it as if to confirm she was really there. Isaac had his tablet playing a movie, but his eyes kept drifting closed. Diane pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages that had exploded in the hours since Mrs. Whitmore's arrest. The video had gone viral, multiple passengers had posted it. #first-class assault was trending nationwide. News outlets were requesting interviews. Her board of directors was in emergency session. Her PR team was melting down. But Diane wasn't interested in damage control. She was interested in transformation. She opened her laptop, connecting to the plane's Wi-Fi, and began typing an email to her entire executive team. The subject of the email is effective immediately, new passenger conduct policies. And the email goes thus. At approximately 2:45 p.m. today, my 3 8-year-old sons were physically assaulted by a passenger in first class while under my supervision. The assault was racially motivated, violent, and traumatizing. It happened on our aircraft, under our watch, in a cabin where passengers pay premium prices for premium treatment. Then the end of the email is, effective immediately, I am implementing the following policies across all flights. Number 1. Zero tolerance policy for passenger violence against children. Any passenger who strikes, threatens, or verbally abuses a minor will be permanently banned from this airline and referred to law enforcement. No exceptions. Number 2. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all first-class passengers. Starting next quarter, any passenger booking first-class tickets will be required to acknowledge and agree to our expanded passenger conduct policy, which explicitly prohibits discriminatory behavior based on race, religion, age, or any protected characteristic. Number 3. Child protection protocols. Flight attendants will receive specialized training on recognizing and responding to threats against minor passengers, with authority to immediately remove threatening passengers without supervisor approval. Number 4. The Mitchell Foundation for Dignified Travel. I'm establishing a foundation providing free first-class travel experiences for children of color, teaching them that they belong in premium spaces, that their presence is valuable, and that no one has the right to make them feel less than. She attached 3 photos: Joshua's swollen cheek, Caleb's red-rimmed eyes, Isaac's tear-stained face. Then she added one more line, these are my sons. But they could be anyone's sons, anyone's children. The fact that I'm CO shouldn't be what makes their assault matter. But since it is, I'm using every bit of that power to ensure no other child experiences what they experienced today. From Diane Mitchell, she hit send, watching the email disappear into the digital void, knowing it would detonate like a bomb in corporate headquarters. Her phone rang immediately. Richard Chin, her chief operating officer. Diane, have you lost your mind? Mandatory training for first-class passengers? We'll lose millions in bookings. The board is going to support me or find new jobs, Diane said calmly. Rich, my children were slapped. On our plane. By a passenger who thought she had the right to discipline black children who offended her sensibilities. If we lose passengers who object to anti-discrimination policies, good. We don't want them. But the financial impact. I don't care about the financial impact. I care about 8-year-olds being able to fly without getting assaulted. I care about creating an airline where everyone is treated with dignity. And if that's not profitable, then I've failed at the only thing that actually matters. She ended the call. Another call came through. Her mother rose. Baby, I just saw the video. Are my grandbabies okay? Diane's composure cracked, hearing her mother's voice. Mama, I wasn't there. I was 20 feet away in that suite, working on reports, and I wasn't there when they needed me. You were there when it counted, Rose said firmly. You protected them. You got justice. And now you're making sure it doesn't happen to other babies. That's what a mother does, Diane. That's what a leader does. But they're so little, Mama. They shouldn't have to learn this lesson yet. No child should ever have to learn it, Rose agreed. But since the world insists on teaching it, at least your boys have a mama who's teaching them they can fight back. That they don't have to accept cruelty. That their lives matter. Diane wiped her eyes. We're still coming, Mama. We'll be there tonight. The boys insisted. They want to surprise you. Tell them Grandma can't wait to hug them. After hanging up, Diane looked at her sleeping sons and made another decision. She opened a new email, this one to every major news outlet. The subject is, CEO statement regarding Flight 2847 incident. Then she started tying. Diane Mitchell, CEO of this airline. Today, my 3 8-year-old sons were assaulted by a passenger who decided black children didn't belong in first class. As a mother, I'm heartbroken. As a black woman, I'm enraged but not surprised. As a CEO, I'm implementing immediate changes to ensure this never happens again. But here's what I want America to understand. My sons had protection today because I'm their mother and I have power. But what about all the other black children traveling without CO mothers? What about the families who experience discrimination and have no recourse? What about the countless incidents that go unrecorded, unpunished, forgotten? Mrs. Patricia Whitmore is in custody tonight. But she's not the disease, she's a symptom. The disease is systemic racism that made her feel entitled to put her hands on my children. The disease is the assumption that black people don't belong in premium spaces. The disease is the casual cruelty that people of color face every single day in the air and on the ground. I'm using my platform to fight that disease. I'm using my power to protect not just my sons, but every child who deserves to travel with dignity. And I'm challenging every other CEO, every leader, every person with influence to ask themselves, what are you doing with your power? Are you perpetuating systems that protect Patricia Whitmore's? Or are you dismantling them? My sons will recover from today's trauma. But they'll never forget it. And neither will I. That's why tomorrow morning, I'm announcing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination initiative in aviation history. Because my children, all our children, deserve better. From Diane Mitchell. She attached the same 3 photos of her son's injuries. Then she hit send. Within minutes, her phone exploded. Every major network is requesting interviews. Social media is erupting. The airline stock was fluctuating wildly as investors tried to predict whether her stance would help or hurt the bottom line. But Diane didn't care about stock prices. She cared about the 3 little boys sleeping beside her, who'd learned today that the world could be cruel. She was going to teach them something else, that their mother would burn down systems to protect them. That power used for justice was the only power worth having. And that sometimes one woman's fury could change an entire industry. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore thought she was slapping 3 unprotected children. She'd actually slapped the CEO's sons. And that mistake would cost more than her freedom. It would cost the comfort of every racist passenger who'd ever felt entitled to abuse people of color in the skies. Because Diane Mitchell was just getting started. The real reckoning was still to come. By the time Flight 2847 landed in Seattle, the world had changed for Patricia Whitmore. Her mugshot was everywhere. Her name was synonymous with racism. Her face had become a meme, a cautionary tale, a symbol of entitled hatred meeting consequences. The hashtag Whitmore slap had 30 million mentions. Her home address had been leaked. Protesters were gathering outside her Connecticut mansion. Her country club had revoked her membership. Her church had asked her to worship elsewhere. And her lawyer, after reviewing the videos from multiple angles, had advised her to plead guilty and hope for leniency. You're on camera, he told her bluntly in the holding cell. Crystal clear footage of you slapping 3 children. Multiple witnesses. The children's mother is the CEO of the airline. The prosecutor is treating this as a hate crime enhancement. Patricia, You're looking at prison time. Real prison time. But I'm 73 years old, she'd wailed. I have medical conditions. I can't survive prison. Then you should have thought about that before you assaulted the CEO's children on camera, her lawyer had replied without sympathy. Now, 24 hours after her arrest, Mrs. Whitmore sat in her attorney's office, watching Diane Mitchell's press conference on CNN. The CEO stood at a podium, flanked by her 3 sons, Joshua's cheek still visibly swollen, the handprint fading but still evident. These are my boys, Diane said to the cameras, her hands on her sons' shoulders. Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac, 8 years old. They were assaulted yesterday by a passenger who decided their skin color disqualified them from first-class treatment. But here's what Mrs. Whitmore didn't understand. My sons don't need first class to be first class. They're extraordinary because of who they are, not where they sit. The boys stood tall, wearing matching shirts that read, "We belong everywhere." I'm establishing the Mitchell Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million, Diane continued. Our mission, to provide free premium travel experiences for children of color, to teach them that they belong in every space, that they deserve dignity and respect regardless of their race. Mrs. Whitmore tried to teach my sons that they didn't belong. I'm going to spend the rest of my career teaching children that they belong everywhere. The press conference erupted with questions. Diane answered each one with grace and steel, her sons beside her, living proof that hatred hadn't broken them. Mrs. Whitmore watched from her lawyer's office, her face gray, her hands trembling. She's destroying my life, she whispered. No, her lawyer corrected. You destroyed your own life when you decided to slap her children. She's just making sure everyone knows what you did. Have you ever watched someone face consequences they spent a lifetime avoiding? Watched privilege evaporate when cameras captured what usually happened in shadows? That's what was happening to Patricia Whitmore, and she was finally understanding that age and wealth couldn't shield her from accountability. Back in Seattle, after the press conference, Diane took her sons to see their grandmother. Rose Mitchell, 80 years old and sharp as ever, gathered her grandsons into her arms and wept. My beautiful boys, she murmured. My brave, strong, beautiful boys. Later, after the boys were asleep, Rose sat with her daughter on the porch of her Seattle home. You know what's going to happen now, Rose said quietly. The backlash. The people who'll say you overreacted. The think pieces about cancel culture and ruining an elderly woman's life. Let them come, Diane said. I'm ready. But are your boys ready? Because this fight, it's just beginning. Diane looked through the window at her sleeping sons, at the children who'd been forced to grow up too fast, to learn too early that the world could be cruel. They're stronger than they know, she said, and I'm going to make sure the world is a little bit better for them. For all children who look like them. Rose nodded. Then let's get to work. The fight was far from over. Mrs. Whitmore's trial was pending. The airline industry was in upheaval. And Diane Mitchell was just getting started transforming how America treated black children in the skies. The real battle was about to begin. 3 months after Flight 2847, Patricia Whitmore stood in a courtroom facing 3 charges, assault and battery on a minor, 3 counts, hate crime enhancement, and child endangerment. Her expensive legal team had tried everything, claiming diminished capacity, arguing the slaps were corrective discipline, suggesting the viral videos were edited or taken out of context. None of it worked. The jury had watched unedited footage from 4 different angles. They'd heard testimony from flight attendants, passengers, and child psychologists who explained the trauma inflicted on Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac. They'd seen the medical photos of handprints on young brown faces. And they'd heard from Diane Mitchell. She'd taken the stand in a navy suit, her voice steady as she described hearing her children crying, seeing the red marks on their faces, watching her sons learn that the world could be violent and cruel based solely on their skin color. Mrs. Whitmore looked at 3 8-year-olds in bow ties and saw threats instead of children, Diane testified. She saw their blackness before she saw their humanity. And she felt entitled, absolutely entitled, to put her hands on them to remind them of their place. That entitlement, that assumption that black children exist for white people to discipline and control, That's what I'm fighting. Not just for my sons, but for every child who deserves better. The defense attorney had tried to paint Diane as vengeful, as using her power to persecute an elderly woman over a moment of poor judgment. Mrs. Mitchell, he'd asked during cross-examination, isn't it true that you're using your position as CEO to ensure Mrs. Whitmore receives the harshest possible punishment? That you're making an example of her? Diane had met his eyes without flinching. Yes, I am making an example of her. Because for too long, people like Mrs. Whitmore have assaulted people like my sons without consequence. For too long, white entitlement has been protected while black children have been told to accept abuse quietly. So yes, I'm using my power to ensure she faces real consequences. And I'd do it again tomorrow. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Now, in the sentencing phase, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney was pleading for leniency. Your Honor, my client is 73 years old. She has no prior criminal record. She's suffered tremendously, lost her social standing, her reputation, her peace of mind. She's been vilified in the media, received death threats, and lived in fear for 3 months. Hasn't she been punished enough? The judge, a black woman in her 50s named Honorable Karen Thompson, looked over her glasses at Mrs. Whitmore. Ms. Whitmore, would you like to address the court? Patricia Whitmore stood, her designer suit hanging looser on a frame that had lost 20 pounds from stress. Her face was haggard, her eyes hollow. Prison scared her. The loss of her comfortable life terrified her. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling, I'm deeply sorry for my actions. I was wrong. I let my prejudices, yes, I'll say it, my racist prejudices, guide my behavior. I hurt 3 innocent children because I couldn't see past their skin color. I deserve punishment. I just hope, her voice broke, I hope the court will show mercy appropriate to my age and the fact that I've already lost everything. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, you're right that you've lost a great deal. Your reputation, your social standing, your comfort. But let me ask you something. Do you think Joshua Mitchell, 8 years old, felt comfortable when you slapped him across the face? Do you think Caleb felt secure when you struck him for defending his brother? Do you think Isaac felt safe when you raised your hand to him? Mrs. Whitmore's head dropped. You took away 3 children's sense of safety, Judge Thompson continued. You taught them that being black in premium spaces makes them targets. You inflicted trauma that they'll carry for years. And you did it because you believed your whiteness gave you authority over their bodies. That, Mrs. Whitmore, is not a moment of poor judgment. That's a lifetime of unchallenged racism finally being exposed. The courtroom was silent. Your attorney argues you've suffered enough. But suffering isn't the same as accountability. Losing your country club membership isn't the same as understanding the harm you caused. Being socially ostracized isn't the same as genuinely reckoning with your actions. Judge Thompson looked at her notes. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sentencing you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will complete 500 hours of community service working with organizations that serve children of color. You will undergo comprehensive anti-racism education and counseling. And you will pay restitution to the Mitchell family for $250,000 to support their foundation providing travel experiences for children affected by discrimination. Mrs. Whitmore's knees buckled. Her attorney grabbed her arm to keep her upright. Furthermore, Judge Thompson added, you are permanently banned from all commercial air travel in the United States. You gave up that privilege when you assaulted children on an aircraft. The bailiff approached to take Mrs. Whitmore into custody. She looked back at Diane, who sat in the gallery with her 3 sons, and for the first time, there was something that might have been genuine remorse in her eyes. I'm sorry, she mouthed. Diane nodded once. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. Mrs. Whitmore was finally, truly sorry, but only because consequences had finally caught up with her. As they led her away, Joshua raised his hand and waved. Not mockery. Not a celebration. Just a child's gesture, innocent and pure, reminding everyone in that courtroom what this had always been about. 3 boys who deserved to fly without fear. 3 children who'd been hurt by hate. 3 8-year-olds who'd somehow survived with their spirits intact, their mother's love surrounding them, their dignity restored. Outside the courthouse, Diane gave her final statement to the press with her sons beside her. Today, justice was served. But our work isn't done. The Mitchell Foundation has already provided first-class travel experiences to 847 children of color across America. We've implemented anti-discrimination policies that 18 airlines have now adopted. We've trained 12,000 flight attendants on recognizing and combating implicit bias. And we're just getting started. She looked down at her boys, these 3 miracles who'd survived hate and emerged stronger. My sons taught me something important, that trauma doesn't have to define you. That being hurt doesn't mean staying broken. That dignity is something no one can take away unless you give it to them. Joshua stepped forward to the microphone. "We're okay now," he said in his 8-year-old voice. "That lady was mean, but we're okay. And if anyone else gets treated badly, they should tell someone. Don't stay quiet. Tell." The press conference ended with applause. Mrs. Whitmore began her prison sentence the next day. And Diane Mitchell returned to running an airline that now led the industry in passenger protection and anti-discrimination policies. The fight wasn't over. It would never truly be over. But today, 3 boys knew that justice was possible. That their mother would move mountains to protect them. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the bad guys actually faced consequences. That had to be enough. For now. 6 months after Mrs. Whitmore began serving her sentence, the ripple effects of Flight 2847 had transformed American aviation in ways nobody could have predicted. Diane's Mitchell Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The initial $50 million had been matched by corporate donations totaling another $73 million. Over 2,500 children of color had experienced first-class travel through the program. Each trip included workshops teaching them about dignity, self-worth, and how to respond to discrimination. But more importantly, complaints about racial profiling in airports and on aircraft had dropped by 41% industry-wide. The policies Diane implemented, mandatory anti-bias training, child protection protocols, zero tolerance for passenger violence, had been adopted by every major U.S. carrier. The FAA had established new regulations requiring all airlines to maintain public databases of permanently banned passengers. Mrs. Whitmore's name sat at the top of that list, a permanent reminder that assault had consequences. Her life in prison was exactly as hard as she'd feared. At 73, she struggled with the noise, the lack of privacy, the loss of all comfort. Her former friends had abandoned her. Her family visited rarely, embarrassed by the association. She'd become a pariah, her name forever linked to racism and child abuse. But Diane felt no satisfaction in Mrs. Whitmore's suffering. She felt something more complex, a recognition that punishment alone didn't heal wounds or change systems. That's why she'd put her energy into prevention rather than revenge. Have you ever wondered what real change looks like? Not just punishing the guilty, but building systems that protect the innocent? That's what the Mitchell Foundation represents, transformation that outlasts any single person's consequences. Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac had started a YouTube channel called Flying While Black, where they documented their travels, interviewed other kids about their experiences with discrimination, and taught viewers about civil rights history. At 9 years old, they had 800,000 subscribers and a message that resonated far beyond aviation. People think racism is just about mean words, Joshua explained in one video, his scar from Mrs. Whitmore's slap barely visible now but forever part of his story. But it's about who gets to feel safe, who gets to take up space, who gets believed when they say something's wrong. We're trying to help everyone feel safe. The boys had testified before Congress about discrimination in travel. They'd met the president. They'd been featured in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People issue, the youngest honorees ever. But more than fame or recognition, they'd maintained their essential sweetness. Still loved coloring. Still fought over video games. Still needed their mama's hugs when nightmares came. Diane watched her sons grow into their advocacy, proud but vigilant. She knew the attention brought risks. Knew that racist trolls sent death threats. knew that her boys would face more Patricia Whitmores in their lives. But she also knew they were prepared, knew they understood their power, knew they'd never accept being made small. 1 year after Flight 2847, Mrs. Whitmore was released on supervised probation, having served her full sentence with no early release. She emerged from prison gaunt, aged, fundamentally altered by the experience. Her first obligation was community service at a youth center in Atlanta, serving the very community she'd shown such contempt for. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Diane arranged to meet her there, bringing her sons along for a conversation Diane knew was necessary for closure. Mrs. Whitmore sat across from the Mitchell family in a quiet room at the center, her hands shaking, her eyes unable to meet theirs. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, her voice rough from disuse. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know, all of you, that prison gave me time to really think, about who I was. About the hate I carried without examining it. About the children I hurt because I couldn't see past their skin color." She finally looked at Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac. "You were just babies. 8 years old. And I hit you. I actually hit you because I thought I had that right. Because I'd spent 73 years believing my comfort mattered more than your safety. I'm ashamed. I'm so deeply ashamed." Isaac, the youngest, the one who'd cried hardest that day, spoke first. "Do you really understand why it was wrong? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" The question was devastating in its clarity. A 9-year-old cutting through to the heart of accountability. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. "Both," she admitted. "I'm sorry I got caught. But I'm also sorry for what I did. It took losing everything to make me see what I'd been all my life. That's not noble. That's pathetic. But it's honest." Diane respected the honesty, even as it confirmed what she'd always known, that people like Mrs. Whitmore only changed when consequences forced them to. That privilege had to be stripped away before empathy could grow. "My sons don't owe you forgiveness," Diane said quietly. "But I hope working with children here teaches you something prison couldn't. That every child deserves dignity. That every person deserves respect. That your comfort will never be more important than someone else's humanity." Mrs. Whitmore nodded, understanding this was as close to absolution as she'd ever receive. As the Mitchell family left the youth center, Caleb looked back at Mrs. Whitmore, who sat alone in that room, the weight of her actions visible in every line of her body. "Mama, do you think she'll really change?" Diane considered the question carefully. "I think she'll try. Whether she succeeds or not isn't our responsibility. Our responsibility is to keep building a world where people like her can't hurt children like you. That's the work that matters." The boys nodded, understanding in their young faces that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, about systems, about ensuring the next Patricia Whitmore couldn't hide her hatred behind age and privilege. That was the legacy of Flight 2847. Not one woman's downfall, but an industry's awakening, and 3 boys who'd survived hate to become agents of change. Mrs. Whitmore's story was cautionary, but Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac's story was inspirational. And in the end, hope always mattered more than hatred, even when hope was hard-won, even when it came with scars that would never fully fade, even when the fight for dignity had to be waged again and again and again. Because some fights were worth it. And these 3 boys, these beautiful, brave, unbreakable boys, were proof of that. 2 years after Flight 2847, Diane Mitchell sat in her office on the 40th floor, looking at a framed photo on her desk. 3 boys in bow ties, coloring in airplane notebooks, taken moments before Patricia Whitmore entered their lives. She kept that photo as a reminder, not of trauma, but of innocence, of the moment before her sons learned that the world could be cruel. Beside it sat another photo, taken last month. Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac at the White House, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their advocacy work. 10 years old now, taller, more confident, but still her babies. The scars from that day weren't visible anymore. But they existed. In the way Joshua sometimes flinched when strangers raised their hands. In how Caleb positioned himself protectively whenever they were in public spaces. In Isaac's nightmares that still came occasionally, Dreams where he couldn't find his mother, where adults hurt him and no one helped. Trauma didn't disappear just because justice was served. It lived in the body, in the mind, in the hypervigilance that Black parents taught their children because survival sometimes depended on it. But her sons had also learned something powerful, that their voices mattered. That standing up could lead to change. That being hurt didn't mean staying broken. Mama? Joshua appeared in her doorway, interrupting her reflection. All three boys visited her office after school most days, doing homework in her conference room while she finished meetings. Yes, baby? There's a girl here. She says her brother got kicked off a plane yesterday because the flight attendant said he looked threatening. He's 12. She wants to know if the foundation can help. Diane's heart clenched. 2 years of change, and it was still happening. Different airlines, different victims, same ugly prejudice. Send her in. A young Black girl, maybe 14, entered nervously. Behind her, a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, wearing a hoodie, carrying a backpack, looking terrified. Ma'am, the girl began, I'm Shanice. This is my brother Marcus. Yesterday, we were flying to visit our dad. Marcus was just sitting there, listening to music, and the flight attendant said he looked suspicious and had him removed. Security searched his bag, found nothing, but we missed our flight. Our dad had to drive 6 hours to get us. And nobody believed us when we tried to explain. But then I saw the Mitchell Triplets YouTube channel, and they said to reach out if we ever face discrimination, so... She trailed off, hope and desperation mixing in her young eyes. Diane came around her desk, kneeling to Marcus's level like she'd done with her own sons that terrible day. Marcus, look at me. What happened to you was wrong. It wasn't your fault. You deserved better. And we're going to make sure the airline knows that. The boy's eyes filled with tears. Everyone was staring at me like I was a criminal. I'm just a kid. I just wanted to see my dad. I know, baby. I know. Diane pulled out her phone, already dialing her legal team. Give me the flight information. The employee's name, if you have it. We're going to handle this. After getting the details and promising the siblings they'd hear back within 24 hours, Diane watched them leave with renewed hope on their faces. Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac had appeared in her doorway, watching the whole exchange. That's the third one this month, Caleb said quietly. How many more, Mama? How many more kids have to go through this? Diane pulled her sons close. Too many. Always too many. That's why we keep fighting. That's why your YouTube channel matters. That's why the foundation matters. That's why every policy we implement, every person we train, every system we change, it all matters. But will it ever end? Isaac asked, his 10-year-old voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd learned too young that the world wasn't fair. I don't know, Diane admitted honestly. Racism is old, baby. Older than this country. Older than any of us. It's baked into systems and hearts and assumptions people don't even know they're making. But every generation pushes it back a little further. Every person who stands up makes the next person stand a little easier. She thought about her own grandmother, who'd lived through Jim Crow, who'd been denied service at restaurants and hotels, who'd faced hatred far more violent than what her grandsons had experienced. She thought about her mother, who'd integrated schools, who'd been one of the first Black students in her university, who'd paved roads Diane had walked more easily. And now her sons, fighting their own battles, making their own progress, pushing that line forward for the next generation. You know what I've learned? Diane said, gathering her boys close. I've learned that change doesn't come from one big moment. It comes from a million small acts of courage. From a girl like Shanice, finding our contact information and deciding to reach out. From passengers on Flight 2847 who pulled out their phones and recorded instead of looking away. From flight attendants like Sarah Chin, who intervened when Mrs. Whitmore raised her hand to Isaac. From a judge who took assault against Black children seriously. From every single person who decided that silence was complicity. Joshua nodded thoughtfully. So we're all part of it? All of us making it better? Exactly. Mrs. Whitmore's punishment mattered. But what mattered more was everyone who chose to be better than her. Everyone who saw you boys being hurt and said, not on my watch. Everyone who's implemented changes to protect the next Marcus, the next Shanice, the next 3 boys in bow ties just trying to fly to grandma's birthday party. She pulled up her computer, showing them the foundation's impact statistics. Look at this. 3,847 children served. 43 airline policy changes implemented. 89,000 flight attendants trained in implicit bias recognition. 127 permanently banned passengers. Complaints down 57% industry-wide. But complaints aren't zero, Caleb pointed out. No, Diane agreed. They're not zero. And they might never be zero. But they're better than they were. And better is how progress happens. One policy at a time. One conversation at a time. One person choosing to examine their biases at a time. She thought about Mrs. Whitmore, now completing her community service, working with children she'd once dismissed as unworthy. The woman would never fully undo the harm she'd caused. But maybe she'd prevent the next Patricia Whitmore from forming. Maybe working with black children day after day would finally teach her what prison and punishment couldn't, that they were just children. Complex, beautiful, deserving children. I want to tell you something important, Diane said to her sons. What happened to you on Flight 2847 was terrible. It was traumatic. It was wrong. And I would give anything to go back and prevent it. But I can't. None of us can change what happened. We can only change what happens next. She gestured to the photo of them at the White House. You boys have turned your pain into purpose. You've helped thousands of kids. You've changed an industry. You've shown the world that being hurt doesn't mean staying silent. That's a gift you've given other children. The gift of knowing they can fight back, they can speak up, they can demand better. But we didn't want to be heroes, Isaac said softly. We just wanted to color pictures and surprise Grandma. I know, baby. You shouldn't have had to be heroes. You should have just been kids. But the world gave you a choice. Let what happened define you as victims, or transform it into something that helps others. You chose transformation. And that's the most powerful thing any of us can do with our pain. Through her office window, Diane could see planes taking off and landing, thousands of passengers traveling every hour, most of them experiencing nothing more dramatic than delays and lost luggage. But somewhere on those planes were children like Marcus. Families like Shanice's. People facing discrimination they shouldn't have to face, fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. And now, because 3 boys had been slapped in first class, there were systems in place to protect them. Policies to defend them. A foundation to support them. A legal precedent that said assault against children mattered, regardless of who their parents were. That was the legacy of Flight 2847. Not just Mrs. Whitmore's downfall. Not just Diane's rage transformed into action. But a shift, small but measurable, in how America treated black children in spaces they had every right to occupy. Come on, Diane said, standing and gathering her sons. We have a family meeting with Marcus and Shanice's case. Let's go show them what the Mitchell Foundation does when someone hurts kids who just wanted to fly. Her sons followed her out, these 3 warriors who'd survived hate, these 3 advocates who were changing the world one flight at a time. Mrs. Whitmore had meant to teach them that they didn't belong. Instead, she'd taught them they had the power to transform systems. That they could turn slaps into strength. That they could use their mother's position and their own voices to protect others. And that sometimes, the worst moments become catalysts for the greatest change. That was the lesson of Flight 2847. Not that racism was defeated, it wasn't. But it could be fought. One policy at a time. One child at a time. One generation at a time. Until the day when no child would need to be as brave as Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac had been. Until the day when first class meant dignity for everyone, not just those who fit a particular image of who belonged. That day wasn't here yet. But Diane Mitchell and her sons were building toward it. One flight at a time. 5 years after Flight 2847, Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac Mitchell, now 13 years old, stood on stage at the United Nations Youth Assembly, addressing delegates from 193 countries about discrimination in global travel. We were 8 years old when a woman decided we didn't deserve respect, Joshua began, his voice strong and clear. She looked at 3 black boys in bow ties and saw problems instead of children. She hit us. And she thought she'd get away with it because that's how the system worked. Caleb continued, but our mother didn't accept that system. She used her power, not just as CEO, but as a woman who'd faced discrimination her entire career, to dismantle it, to rebuild it, to create something better. Isaac finished. And now, 5 years later, over 50,000 children have traveled through the Mitchell Foundation. Discrimination complaints in U.S. aviation are down 72%. 12 countries have adopted similar protections. And kids like us, kids who get judged by their skin before anyone knows their names, they have hope that things can change. In the audience, Diane Mitchell watched her sons with tears streaming down her face. Her babies, who'd once cried in first class with handprints on their cheeks, were now advocates on a global stage. They turned trauma into transformation, pain into purpose, victimization into victory. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore had completed her sentence, her community service, her mandated education. She would never fly commercially again, would never regain her social standing, would carry the shame of her actions for whatever years she had left. But more importantly, she'd become a cautionary tale, a reminder that hatred has consequences. That privilege doesn't protect prejudice forever. That children, especially black children, deserve protection, dignity, and justice. The Mitchell Foundation had grown beyond aviation. It now addressed discrimination in schools, healthcare, housing, every space where black children faced bias. The initial $50 million had multiplied tenfold through donations and partnerships. Diane had inspired other CEOs to use their platforms for change, creating a ripple effect across industries. But the work was never finished. Every day brought new cases. New Marcus and Shanices. New families are facing prejudice. New children learning too young that the world could be cruel. The question isn't whether racism will ever completely end, Diane had told her sons recently. The question is, what will you do while it still exists? Will you accept it as inevitable? Or will you fight it with everything you have? Her sons had chosen to fight, and their fight had inspired millions. Thank you for watching, gentlemen, the story of Joshua, Caleb, Isaac, and Diane Mitchell. If you believe that no child, regardless of race, should ever be slapped for sitting in a seat their family paid for, if you think justice matters more than protecting privileged people from consequences, if you believe that power should be used to protect the powerless rather than punish them, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that discrimination isn't a relic of the past. It's happening today, on planes, in stores, in schools, everywhere. Subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate those brave enough to fight it. What would you have done in Diane Mitchell's shoes? Would you have pressed charges against an elderly woman? Would you have used your position as CEO to transform an entire industry? Or would you have accepted an apology and moved on to avoid controversy? Tell us honestly in the comments what you would have done. Do you think racial discrimination and prejudice can truly end? What concrete steps do you believe need to happen to curb it? Is serving justice to individuals like Patricia Whitmore enough? Or do we need deeper systemic changes in how we raise children, how we train employees, and how we hold institutions accountable? Do you think one CEO's response can change an industry, or does transformation require sustained pressure from customers, lawmakers, and society? Tell us your honest opinion, because these conversations are how movements begin. And if you want racism to become a thing of the past in our country and world at large, if you want to be like Diane Mitchell, using whatever power and platform you have to protect children, turning personal tragedy into systemic reform, refusing to accept that this is just how things are, then share this video and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can create a world where Patricia Whitmore's actions become unthinkable instead of commonplace. Together, we can build systems that protect all children, not just those with powerful parents. Together, we can ensure that no 8-year-old ever again gets slapped in first class for the crime of being black. Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac Mitchell were 8 years old when they learned that hatred exists. But they were also 8 years old when they learned that their mother would move heaven and earth to protect them. That justice was possible. That change could happen. That trauma could be transformed into advocacy that helps thousands. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore thought she was disciplining 3 unprotected children. She was actually assaulting the CEO's sons, and that mistake cost her everything. But more importantly, it sparked a movement that continues to this day, protecting children she never thought about, in places she'll never see, because one mother refused to accept that assault against Black children was just how things are. The question now is, what will you do with this story? Will you share it so others understand that discrimination still happens? Will you examine your own biases, your own assumptions about who belongs in premium spaces? Will you speak up the next time you witness injustice instead of looking away? Will you teach your children, your grandchildren, that every person deserves dignity regardless of their skin color? Or will you close this video and forget it, comfortable in the belief that racism is someone else's problem? Because the next Joshua, Caleb, and Isaac are out there right now. Boarding a plane, entering a classroom, walking into a store, facing someone who's decided they don't belong based on nothing but the color of their skin. And whether they survive that encounter with their dignity intact depends on whether the rest of us, all of us, decide that protecting children matters more than protecting prejudice. The choice is yours, gentlemen. Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose to be the person who stands up instead of looking away. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change a child's life. And sometimes, changing one child's life changes the entire world. That's the legacy of Flight 2847. That's the power of one mother's love transformed into action. That's the promise that justice, however imperfect, however delayed, is still possible. If we're willing to fight for it. One flight at a time. One child at a time. One generation at a time. Until the day when no child needs to be as brave as these 3 boys were. Until racism truly becomes a thing of the past. That day isn't here yet. But people like Diane Mitchell are building toward it. The question is, will you help build with them? Your answer starts now.